Okay, so we are looking at Leviticus, a guide to public health. So first, we're going to start with a definition of health. Health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. And we've been doing this, especially Dr. Douglin, on a regular basis, doing health promotion and promoting health, not just about disease. And then there's the definition of public health. There are a number of different definitions we can use, and I chose two very simple ones. First, the science and art of promoting health, preventing disease, and prolonging life through organized efforts of society. So you notice it has a little more than just the definition of health. There's actual organization and health promotion. And then the other one is public health. Let me just minimize these, right? The science and practice of protecting and improving the health of a community as by preventative medicine, health education, control of communicable diseases, as we are seeing now with COVID, application of sanitary measures, as we saw in Leviticus, and monitoring of environmental hazards, as we saw recently with St. Vincent with the volcano, right? That is an environmental hazard. So public health spans across all these different things. And there are two main system activities of public health. There's health promotion, which we've been doing on a regular basis, Sabbath after Sabbath. This is health promotion. And then there's disease prevention, which is kind of linked to health promotion as well, because if you are promoting good health and you're having physical activity, eating healthy, not smoking, using alcohol, using drugs, all of these things would help you to prevent you from getting disease. And then there's also the other arm in terms of communicable diseases where there's vaccination. And I know right now there's a lot of up in arms about vaccinations for adults, but this is how we would have protected our children throughout many, many years, vaccinations to prevent them from getting communicable diseases. And we'll go into a little more detail on this a little later. There are really three prongs to prevention. There's primary prevention, secondary prevention, and tertiary prevention. And primary prevention is really all about health promotion. Before you even are at risk or anything, you want to keep healthy. So you want to exercise, you want to eat right and all that. So that is primary prevention. Secondary prevention is more about screening, more about at-risk persons. So let's say, for instance, you're 40 years old, you're a Black man, you might want to be screened for prostate cancer. Okay, this is what we would refer to as secondary prevention, because there's also a risk that you can test positive, which means that you have the cancer and then you deal with it. So screening is considered secondary prevention, but you're still preventing, because even if you have, let's say, colon cancer, prostate cancer, you catch it early, then you can deal with it. So that is considered as secondary prevention. Now, tertiary prevention is, let's say you're diabetic, and let's say you have cancer or whatever. How do you prevent the progression? What do you do? You can have diabetes reversal, or you can prevent complications like heart disease or amputations. Barbados was considered the amputation capital because of the diabetes and the uncontrolled diabetes for many, many years. So this is considered as tertiary prevention. Now, there are ethical values, and I know that some of you will be very interested in these ethical values of public health, because this is what some people use to say, I have a right not to take the vaccine because of these ethical values. And there are about 5 areas considered in ethical values. Beneficence. And beneficence is a value in which the provider takes action or recommends courses that are in the patient's best interests. So whatever you do in public health should be in the patient's best interests, but it's not as easy as that all the time. So it is not coercing or manipulating some person to do something, or it is not euphemism, which is basically deciding I'm at the end of my road and I want to die. And then, is keep the individual patient in mind, and beneficence is not the same for all situations. And I'll give some examples too. And when patient autonomy is compromised, let's say in a person that is incapacitated and a decision has to be made, then this is where beneficence must come into play to guide the ethics in the situation. All right. And then there's non-maleficence, or this, which is not to provide any harm to the patient, not to do anything that would propose harm in any way to the patient. So in other words, you have to look and weigh the treatment with the benefits and with the harm to the patient. And we see this even in terms of chemotherapy and cancer. The patient has to make the decision. Is that going to cause me more harm than benefit? And these are decisions that they would have to make. In terms of surgery on an elderly person, okay, what is the risk? Is that surgery going to benefit the elderly, or because the person is so old and fragile, then it would be more at risk? So these are things that you have to take into consideration when we're looking at that. And then there's autonomy. And as we all know, autonomy is your right. Autonomy is our ability to make decisions and have a say in the direction of our lives and our health. So persons are saying, okay, I have the right not to get a vaccine. This is my right. And truthfully so, it is their right. But it's also the right of that 87-year-old grandmother or mother that lives in the house with you and you're going out, in and out all the time. They have the right to life too. So how do we weigh that? But they're both rights. And then there is social justice. And basically, as you know, social justice means equality. It means to have the same rights. And, really and truly, do I have the same right if I'm Black as a person who is white in terms of accessing healthcare? In Barbados, maybe yes, because we are 98% Black. But if I'm living in England or Switzerland or somewhere else, do we have the same rights? Okay, so that is something we need to look at. Then we need to look even closer home. If I am in the church, do I have the same right as a straight person, as a gay person? Does a gay person have the same rights as me to healthcare and to everything else? How do you view it? So their rights. If I am poor and you're rich, do we have the same rights to healthcare? Or do I have to go on a waiting list and wait 10 months because I can't afford to pay for my surgery? Do we have the same rights? So these are things that we have to take into account when we're looking at social justice. And then there's truth telling. Should my family prevent me from knowing what is going on in my body? Should they determine and tell the doctor, well, no sense telling the person that they have a few weeks to live because then they will get all agitated and everything else? Or should I have the right to know what is happening to me? All right, so this is truth telling. And maybe if I know, then I'm able to deal with it better than wondering all the time and not knowing. So that is truth telling. So these are the ethical values of public health, and they're basically 5 ethical values, and we can have examples for all of them. But how do we balance ethical conflicts? And this is what we are seeing, and this is what we had seen over many years. There's justice, there's race, there's gender, class, equity, but does your right outweigh the right of the community? And this is what we have to look at constantly. So the public health practice is always struggling to find the correct balance between respect for an individual, autonomy and decision-making, and the need for limitations on individuals in order to achieve social justice or in order to benefit a wider cross-section of people. And this is always the case. So it's a balancing act. And let's look at Leviticus now. And we're actually looking at Leviticus 11 to 15. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail in the text, but I can just give a synopsis. So Leviticus speaks about the sanitary laws. And these were actually the first public health measures. And an early record of these laws is recorded in Leviticus 11 to 16, but I'm going to stop at 15 because we're not going to go into the atonement and all of that. So actually in Leviticus 11, it speaks about nutrition. It speaks about clean and unclean foods. And then in Leviticus 12, it looks at maternal and child health and the purification after birth. And in Leviticus 13, it looks at hygiene. It looks at regulations about the defiling skin diseases and molds. And then in Leviticus 14, again, it looks at hygiene and cleansing from defiling skin diseases and molds. And in Leviticus 15, it actually looks at sexual health, and it looks at discharges and causing uncleanness, etc. So overall, we see that the Hebrew people had some of the first public health laws or codes, sanitation and hygiene, health inspection. So they actually had the priests that would come and inspect the house looking for molds, and then the lepers would have to go to the priest for inspection before they could be considered as cured. They also had the first set of quarantine laws, where persons were asked to remain away from other people. And then it's only when they came before the priest and the priest considered them as cleansed that they can come back into the community of people. And then there were also dietary guidelines, as we see. First in Genesis, we were given the ideal diet. And then it's only after the flood then you were told which foods or which meats you can eat and which you should not eat. And then again, there was the sexual health that was given in Leviticus. If you had a discharge, you were considered unclean and you could not go in onto a woman. And then you also, had to make sure where you sit or the saddle you ride on and everything was clean. And then even to go further, they had the first work-rest balance, where they worked 6 days and they rested on the 7th day. And even the land, they was working 6 years. You should sow and prune, and then on that 7th year, you should rest the land. And then they also dealt with caring for the poor. And this is very important, as when we start to look at the Moyne Commission, you would see how poor relates to the actual health standards. And then there was the environmental stewardship. So all of these things are covered in Leviticus that are examples to us today. So we'll look at a few of them individually. Leviticus 11. We saw, as I mentioned in Genesis 1:29, we were given the ideal diet. Every plant yielding seed, every tree which has fruit yielding seed. So this was the ideal diet. So don't let us forget that God guided us and gave us the ideal diet. It was only after the flood, then, rather than people eating anything, the Lord then in Leviticus 11 started to show them. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, say to the Israelites, of all the animals that live on land, these are the ones that you may eat. And you may eat any animal that has a split hoof, completely divided, and that chews the cud. And they especially identify things like swine not to eat. And we came down as Seventh-day Adventists knowing the good meats and the bad meats. But really and truly, if we go back to the ideal diet, we go back to Genesis and eat the herbs, etc., rather than sticking with the meats. But some people open up Leviticus and say, you see, the Lord give us meat to eat so we can eat meat. So you have no argument that this is not correctly true. All right. But the important thing is that scientists now have found that even the pig, the swine, has some hormones that are very close to the human hormones that would lead to different cancers. So, but in Leviticus, they had already identified those meats that you should not have eaten. So nutrition is one of the first public health tools that is mentioned in Leviticus, nutrition. So God is concerned with what we eat, because what we eat impacts on our health, our longevity, our emotions, and people don't realize that, and our ability to function. So we need to make sure we have nutritious foods and foods that provide good health. And then in Leviticus 12, when it actually looks at maternal and child health, and we tend to overlook that a lot. But really and truly, the Lord said to Moses, say to the Israelites, a woman who has become pregnant and gives birth to a son, and it also speaks about a daughter as well, because I read that other part, but I'm just highlighting this, son will be ceremonially unclean for 7 days, just as she is unclean during her monthly period. So in other words, where there's lots of blood, is being recommended at that time that you go apart from everybody else. Now remember, the advancement wasn't like today. So there was no sanitary napkins you can change 3 times a day, and showers in the house where you can bathe and stuff like that. So it was a lot of bloody cloths and prone to infection and everything. So God was given information to protect those women at that particular time. And then on the 8th day, the boy is to be circumcised. This has also proven over the years that circumcision benefits prevention of disease. And even in terms of HIV, even in terms of some of the sexually transmitted infections, being circumcised helps to protect the male child from these, and also the female, because it's been shown to that a man that is circumcised, the wife would have a reduced chance of getting cervical cancer. So this information was there from the beginning, but as we went on throughout the years, we ignored a lot of it, but it was important information. So God is concerned that we're not in danger ourselves or our children, and they're living at that time, the Israelites were living in the desert where there was heat, where there was infection. And as I mentioned to you, hygiene wasn't quite what it should be or what we know today. So this was an opportunity then to provide those sanitary laws to the people and meet them where they were at that particular time. And then Leviticus 13 dealt with the communicable diseases. And at that time, leprosy was the main communicable disease at that time. So the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, when anyone has a swelling or a rash, all right, and any form of infectious skin disease, he must be brought to Aaron the priest or to one of his sons who is a priest. So in other words, you had to show yourself to the priest would examine it and then would tell you if you have leprosy or if you're okay to go. And reading in Leviticus, they also would quarantine for 7 days first, and then they would come back. And then they would quarantine again for another 7 days, which would make it 14 days. And then they would come back and you would decide then, okay, this rash has spread and you have leprosy. then you have to go out and live on your own. You can't be among the people anymore. So now you have to isolate, okay, outside of the camp, and you can't come into the camp. So these are some of the laws that were put in place, the regulations that were put in place from the very beginning. So now we are seeing protocols in place because of our pandemic, but in the past, they already had their protocols in place, and we are looking to ignore them. But Leviticus pointed out closely all the regulations, and they went into a lot of detail in Leviticus in terms of how to examine and what you had to do if you didn't fit the bill, etc. So that is important for us to know, that there were always regulations. There isn't no government now coming and dominating anything to you. As long as there's public health, there's regulations, and there are measures that were always in place. And it says here, and God is concerned about communicable diseases. And throughout the years we've seen, and I will mention a few as we go on, lots of communicable diseases. And even in Leviticus, it spoke about the skin and it spoke about clothing. So there was clothing that was soiled. If it was soiled to the extent it had to be burnt, if it was just minimally soiled, then it could have been washed. So these are things that were also put in place. So some of the regulations in Leviticus 14, the Lord said to Moses, these are the regulations for the diseased person at the time of his ceremonial cleansing, when he is brought to the priest. The priest is to go outside the camp and examine him, not inside, so that person could not come into the camp. And if the person has been healed of his infectious skin disease, then the person would be considered, they had to go and wash, and then they would be considered clean. And then the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, now they're looking at the mildew in the houses. When you enter the land of Canaan, which I am giving you as your possession, and I put a spreading mildew in a house. Now, God doesn't put anything in the house, but it is there. This is how they spoke in those days. The owner of the house must go and tell the priest, I have seen something that looks like mildew in my house. Now, this is really a fungus. And the priest is to order the house to be emptied before he goes in to examine the mildew. And if he finds that this fungus is spreading throughout, then it had to be thoroughly cleaned. And again, today, we don't see as much stuff like this, but we know that there is fungi like Aspergillus that can actually kill you. It can get into your brain and cause disease. So right then in Leviticus, they were protecting the people with the knowledge that they had at the time. Now we have a bit more knowledge, and we know how to prevent with the sunlight and everything. And in Leviticus 15, then it dealt with the sexually transmitted infections. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, speak to the Israelites and say to them, when any man has a bodily discharge, the discharge is unclean. Whether it continues flowing from his body or is blocked, he still had a discharge, he still had the illness. And in that day, I am sure what they were speaking about was syphilis, because syphilis was rampant in the Bible days. And it will make him unclean. And this is how his discharge will bring about uncleanness. So, and then throughout the chapter, it spoke about a woman having a discharge too and having to go out of the camp. And then it also spoke about a woman having her menstrual cycle that had to go out as well. All right, so these are things from the very beginning, and it spoke about a man going on to a woman and making her unclean as well. So from very early, the Bible in Leviticus spoke about sexually transmitted infections and how to deal with them. And it considered them, you still needed to quarantine and spend a time away as well. So now for us to look briefly at the history of public health. And from very early, the Romans developed the discipline of sanitary engineering, and they built a lot of waterworks and sewers, and they were extravagant, even more so than we see today. And there were numerous of public latrines that they built, and baths and fountains, because the important thing was to know that people had to wash, and washing away was important in those days, to wash and to cleanse yourself. And however, the Roman slums were overcrowded and the streets were stacked with feces. And they realized at that time that the feces was causing disease and it was spreading to other persons. So as early as 500 to 1500, disease was seen as punishment. And we know this from back in Bible time, punishment for sin and the work of possession of the devil or witchcraft. So persons would come for healing, and the disciples would be talking about their sins, etc. So the next advance in public health was the quarantine of disease-carrying ships, because you know at that time ships had to carry everything, and we saw the plague that was passed by rats, rattus, in the ships, when the rats got into the ships, and then they would go from all over China straight through to Africa and other places. So that is how quarantine then came in. So the word quarantine was derived from quarantita, meaning 40. So the ships had to rest for 40 days before and be thoroughly cleaned before they can proceed. So it was first used between 1377 and 1403, when Venice and the other chief maritime cities of the Mediterranean adopted and enforced a 40-day detention for all vessels entering the ports. So this is how quarantine first came about. And then there were regulations, and everything really started in the UK, and America started to adopt a lot of it after. So then there were police functions from as early as the medieval times in the towns of Europe. They developed police institutions that address the civic matters, things like water and sewage and waste. So you actually had police directing these things. And you also had in 1745 in Vienna, a system of complete medical police, where they dealt with reproduction and nutrition and public safety and burial and regulations of the medical fraternity, everything they dealt with. So you actually had police dealing with all of these different things. So the English statutory and common law recognize the right of the state to quarantine and limit the movement of the plague carriers. So in other words, they were quarantined or they were isolated rather than spreading to other people. And Blackstone observed that disobeying quarantine orders merited severe punishments and even death. So that is how strong those quarantine rules were at that particular time. And then the American colonies, they adopted all of the English laws in order to control their diseases. So when they had the Constitution, they put the power into the states. Each individual state then had the power to quarantine and protect the community. So, and it's well recognized, the principle that it is one of the first duties that a country, remember, country like Barbados, the duty is of the government to put all of those various protocols in place to protect the health and comfort of its inhabitants. So if we fall under that, this country, then we have to abide. So whoever is coming into the country have to abide by those policies and by those protocols. So the preservation of the public health is universally conceded to be one of the duties devolving upon the country as a sovereignty, and whatever responsible tends to preserve the public health is a subject upon which the legislature within its police power may take action. So in other words, when we put all of that power into place, we have to make sure that we, even as Christians and as citizens, we abide by whatever powers are put in place. And some of the key events, and I'm going to move quickly down to the end of the history of public health. The first vaccine was Edward Jenner in 1798 when he discovered the cowpox vaccine, and that quickly grew into the smallpox vaccine. And in 1840, England started to give free vaccination. But you know, like we're seeing today, people started to rebel. They did not want to be vaccinated. They wanted to have their autonomy and their right to choose not to be vaccinated. So in 1853, then vaccines become compulsory. And in the 19th century, the Great Sanitary Awakening, when they saw all the filth in the streets and they realized that it was spreading to other people, then they started to put measures in place. And the urbanization came when everybody wanted to move to the towns, and you had the poor and the rich. So in the towns, the wealthy realized that they could not escape contact with the poor. But notice that the poor were the ones who were always sick because of the hygiene. And therefore, all of the diseases of the poor was being spread to the wealthy. So then the wealthy had to make sure that they address the poverty and they take care of the poor people in order to stop the disease from spreading to the richer people. So that's how it started. And in 1838, the General Report on the Sanitary Conditions of the Laboring Population in Great Britain was then publicized. So we saw how bad that situation was even before it get down to the Moyne Commission. Then the average age at death in those affluent persons were 36 years old. When Christ died at 37, we thought that, you know, that was a young age. But really and truly, around this time, the tradesman died at 22 years old. That was the life expectancy of the day. And the laborer, 16 years old. Can you imagine that? So if you were a little kind of wealthy and, you know, professional, you were able to live to 36 years old. But when you're a tradesman, 22, and laborer, 16 years old. Today, Barbados life expectancy is 79 years old. So you see how far we have come from that time. And we have Switzerland, who probably have one of the highest life expectancy in the world at 84 years old. USA is 79, just the same as Barbados. So we've moved a long way. And then in Edwin Chadwick, he looked at the removal of sewage and waste and the establishment of health boards and district medical officers. And then there was the Public Health Act in 1848. And the age of liberalism, the health is the name of the people. So in other words, they're now putting the people at the center to make sure that you provide health for all people. And in 1851, the International Conference in Paris had the quarantine regulations. So by then we were seeing some pandemics stepping up, and therefore we needed to put quarantine regulations in place. And in 1902, International Sanitary, the Bureau of the Americas and the Pan-American Sanitary Bureau. And in 1907, they actually established a committee looking at hygiene to focus really on the public health. And I just want us to touch a little bit on the Moyne Commission. Very early, and you would have heard some of this history, George Washington contracted smallpox. Smallpox was rampant in Barbados, and something like TB, you know, was rampant as well. And we had a lot of slaves that brought diseases from Africa to Barbados, and the whites were in Barbados as well. And really and truly, only the whites were being looked after, not the Blacks. And the Blacks were getting the diseases and spreading them to the whites. And it was a whole, you know, the political, the economic, the health system, everything was awful. And therefore, okay, and therefore, there was the situation where persons started to riot. And that's when we heard about the riots, 1934 to 38 riots. All right. And England decided, okay, they're going to set up a royal commission led by Lord Moyne to look and to investigate the situation in the British West Indies. And of course, here in Barbados fell into that. So then in 1923, we had Dr. John Hatson, who looked at the Poor Law. In 1937, when after the disturbances broke out, that's when they sent the Royal Commission led by Lord Moyne. And then there were the recommendations that came after World War II in 1945. So it took a couple years to put them in place. And in 1946, the World Health Organization was formed, and there were 61 countries that attended the conference in New York at that particular time. So we had Barbados Health Services then starting to develop. So in the 1950s was the first modern public health services in the region, and that was led by Dr. Morris Bayer. And all of you would know because the polyclinic in the north was named after Dr. Morris Bayer. And in 1953 was the first public health center in St. Peter, Morris Bayer Polyclinic. And we had M. Moore in 55 and 6 Rose in 1957. But in 1954, the government passed legislation and implement social reforms to improve workers' rights and conditions. And we had things like that we take for granted now, like the Aedes aegypti mosquito that was rampant in Barbados causing disease. And they had to look at that. They had to look at latrines. Because most people were using pit toilets on the outside, and then, you know, the health wasn't as good. And in 1960s, we had water piped from, rather than running to the standpipes, pipe right to your house. So 95% of the houses then had water. But at that time, there were still a lot of infirmities. And in terms of the family planning, they had to establish the Barbados Family Planning Associate. It was established. And then in 1957, the public health laboratory was established at Enmore and at Spipestown and 6 Roads, right? And then the QEH was built in 1963. And then there was also a private hospital in 1966, the St. Joseph Hospital, which is still there, but not functioning. So all of these things we saw as the development of public health. We had 4 government and 5 private hospitals. We look at map now, we have only 1 private hospital, but in those days, and even if you look at Jamaica now, Jamaica has lots of different hospitals all over Jamaica. While we, because we're smaller anyway, stick to 1 government hospital and 1 private hospital. But before we had more, and then they were turned into what we call AMSOS. And in 1970s, a lot of the diseases that affected Barbados were no longer affecting Barbados because of the high standards of healthcare. So the infant malnutrition, the tetanus, the diphtheria, the whooping cough, the typhoid, the syphilis, streptococcal pneumonia, scarlet fever, all these things were rampant in Barbados in the early days. And by 1970s, they were all dealt with. So my last slide, in the 1950s, nationwide campaigns on health. And then in 1977, the World Health Assembly had a resolution of all citizens of the world by year 2000 of a level of health that would permit them to lead a socially and economically productive life. And in 1978, you would have heard it talk about the Declaration of Alma Ata, which is primary health care as the main strategy to achieve health for all. By 1980, and I just want to make this clear, because of vaccines, smallpox was eradicated. All right, because enough persons would have been vaccinated, and then there was herd immunity and there was no more smallpox. So all of those early deaths from smallpox, no more. And then in 1988, we had the eradication of polio. And remember, that was because of vaccine as well. So that would have protected those young children and eradicate polio. So there were many great achievements in public health over the century. Vaccination was one, motor vehicle safety, the fact that you had to wear seat belts, there was a speed limit. All of those things helped to put, all of that is public health, put measures in place for safety. And then there were also safer workplaces. Persons had to wear helmets, had to wear braces if they were climbing. Different things were put in place. All of those are public health measures. And then there was the control of infectious diseases. As we see now with this COVID, certain measures are always put in place with infectious diseases. And then there was the decline in deaths from coronary heart disease and stroke. Persons were better monitored. There was better health promotion in terms of what you should eat, how you should take your medication, etc. And then there were safer, healthier foods. Now, you know, everybody is into health foods now. Not everybody, but a lot of persons are into eating healthier. And then there are healthier mothers and babies. There's prenatal clinics, postnatal clinics, there's family planning centers, everything. So mothers and babies now are safer. And then even in terms of drinking water, there's fluoridation to help to protect teeth and to make babies stronger, whatever. And then there's the recognition of tobacco as a hazard. So now we have safe spaces. So you can't be smoking all over and inhaling side stream smoke. Then persons are educated about marijuana use, about alcohol intake. So public health has gone a great way. And vaccine played a very important role in that public health. So I'm going to stop there. And if we have time for any questions, you can feel free to ask. Is my time up? Or I see Sister Lilith hand. Go ahead, Sister Lilith.
It's a question that I wondered often when reading, through Leviticus and Numbers. Did they not have soap in those days? And was it because they had to wash themselves in flowing water to be clean? But
yeah.
when was soap invented?
I am not sure, but I know they didn't have soap in those days. Yeah, soap wasn't invented at that time, but the running water was important. Yeah. So everything comes with different, we can Google it quickly to see when soap was invented, but we never heard any talk of soap. It was just washing away. Even when the priests looked at persons, they would tell them, okay, go and wash, and wash with running water. So I don't think that they had soap. As I said, hygiene evolved over the years, so there was a lot of things that they didn't have in place, and all those rags that made the women unclean, that caused them to have to go out and wait until the cycle was finished, those 7 days. I mean, we don't have to do things like that now. And
I often wonder when I hear things about European civilization, there's so much that we haven't been told about the civilizations in Africa. For example, we know the first university and first communities and kingships came out of Africa. But I wonder what they were doing in Africa in terms of things like that. I can't believe that Europe just got all this knowledge on its own.
Yes, they did. And well, France too was one of the, I guess, one of the better public health measures. But yeah, and the US kind of just adopted a lot of the laws coming down. And then, of course, the West Indies, as it was called then, and not the Caribbean, only got much later because they realized that the white plantation owners and the families that they brought down was becoming infected. And that's the only reason why they started treating the slaves and the Black people, because it was spreading to them. Mr. Kelman? Thank you, Mr. Kelman.
Good evening.
Good evening.
You mentioned that with herd immunity, there was the eradication of smallpox, etc. Is there presently herd immunity given what obtains in the this pandemic, the COVID pandemic? I ask that question because Bill Gates is predicting that later this year there will be a pandemic similar to what obtains today. Can herd immunity in any way eradicate the COVID-19 virus?
Everything is possible, and it can, but these chances are seeming very slim, because right now most of the Caribbean are just around 50-something%. You don't get herd immunity with 54% and 60%. Herd immunity usually comes with 80% or so. So if persons are lagging in taking the vaccine, we will never reach herd immunity. And then what we're also seeing with this particular virus is the changes that are happening in the virus means that, let's say Omicron for sure, the Omicron seemed to be pretty resistant to the vaccine. And therefore, persons who would have gotten COVID, gotten Delta, gotten Alpha are coming back and getting Omicron. So that means that not even their bodies were protecting them against Omicron. So therefore, we would not see herd immunity like that if you're becoming reinfected with another strain of the vaccine. What you really have to do is to have total immunity in order for herd immunity to develop. So chances are slim, but it's not impossible. But it would mean that a lot more persons will have to get the vaccine or will have to get the virus and become protected in order for herd immunity to develop. But right now, no.
Forgive me, but it would seem to me that there's no vaccine for the COVID, or regardless if there's, well, I can't even say herd immunity.
That there's no vaccine for
the present virus that is going around.
You mean for
COVID-19?
There is a vaccine and it has helped. It doesn't prevent you. The thing is that there are different types of vaccines. And what we realized earlier, and what all the scientists realized earlier, is that this particular vaccine is not preventing you from getting the virus, but it is preventing you from getting very sick and dying. So that was the purpose of the vaccine earlier, Clark. Where there are some other vaccines where we saw in those childhood vaccines that prevented them from getting the virus. So that is the difference between the two.
And also, Carmita, good evening.
Hi, good evening.
Did Germany reach that 80% or more?
I am not sure where Germany reached, but as I said to you, that this Omicron seemed to be pretty resistant. So even if Germany had reached that with Delta and with Alpha, the Omicron now is posing another problem, because the vaccine, don't forget, when vaccines are made, usually what they do is they get a number of the different strains, especially the flu vaccine. And every year a new flu vaccine is made. And what they do is they use the most prominent strains to produce the vaccine. So if you have the 4 strains that you're using to produce the vaccine and another strain comes along, it might not protect you against that new strain. There's always a possibility, but the old strains it will protect you against. And that's what's happening with the flu virus. So every October, you would find that you have to get a flu vaccine. And even if you get that flu vaccine, sometimes it's still a possibility that you get the flu because there's another strain. So there's no perfect way to it.
So we can therefore then prepare ourselves to be constantly receiving quote unquote vaccines to prevent COVID-19 and the Omicrons and those that will follow.
I would say that because I think I said that from the beginning, that this might become an annual vaccine that you have to take every year. Because also to what they were seeing is that the life of the immunity seemed to be like 6 months to a year, and not, a lifetime immunity, just like the influenza. Your resistance only lasts from one October to the other. It doesn't last a lifetime. Otherwise, every year you wouldn't have to go and get it. So, but these are all things that they're still grappling with. All the information isn't out there yet, but that is what it's looking like.
Good evening, Karen.
Hi, good evening.
When what was when we were going to school, you used to get a little lump of sugar.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
What was it that used to be in medication?
Elliot would have to tell you that, but that was basically like a vaccine. That was the polio, right?
Polio vaccine.
Yeah, but I can't tell you what are the ingredients. I would have to Google that to tell you. I can't tell you the exact. Al, you have any idea? Al?
Hello, you did, but that was the attenuated poliovirus by Salk. The Salk polio vaccine.
Okay, thank you. So that's okay, Grace?
That's Erica wanted to know, so I will have
right.
to know.
Okay, so that was attenuated. But all attenuated mean is that they kill the virus, so the virus can infect you, but then you just make the vaccine with it. So,
okay,
yeah. Yes, go ahead.
I was glad for your explanation to Brother Jeffrey just now, because I was just going to say practically the same thing. In my reading up, in my listening, in my what little knowledge I will have gained from studies, like you are correct in saying that this virus is going to be an annual thing. And Brother Jeffrey, you are correct. We're going to have to be prepared to have a shot every year or twice a year for this, because it is just like the flu virus, where the immunity wanes with every shot every year. I know, Sister Karamita, you get your flu shot every year, correct?
I used to, but actually I haven't had it recently. But when I worked at the UN, I got it every year. And then after I left the UN, I used to get it every year. But within the last 4 years, I don't think I took any.
Right, and that was part of the job. As you correctly said, you look for the 4 strongest or most virulent strains, and you make the vaccine for that year along those lines to have as many people as possible. But there will never be herd immunity with a coronavirus. Never. Because as you rightly said, it will change from year to year. And there are some people who are going to get very sick. There are some people who are going to get slightly sick. And there will be those who will not get sick at all. For us in Barbados, this is the flu season. Am I wrong?
Usually flu season, it could be, but it usually starts around October and go through, So around this time, should be the flu season.
Right. So therefore, you will find that the majority of Barbadians will not get seriously ill with the flu. And there will be some who will easily die from the flu here in Barbados. But for the most part, most Barbadians will escape it. So as you correctly say, as time goes by, we will see that even with the coronavirus, there will be some people who will get sick, there will be some people who will get moderately sick, and there will be some people who will get severely sick. it is going to be something we're going to have to live with. So
Yeah.
let's not throw our hands up in the air. But what I want to ask about, though, you had made a point earlier about the move from pit toilets to water toilets. How it has been an advancement in health. I need to get some clarity on that, because I know when we had pit toilets years ago, we got away from the going outside when the rain was falling, or having to sit down on a toilet where cockroaches down inside running about, and you got a piece of paper that lighted down in there. And it felt uncomfortable. It felt like back in the slave days and such like, right? But how is it an advancement? Because now we have a situation where I'm not looking at convenience now, although convenience seems to be the biggest way out when it comes to the waterborne toilets and such like. Back in my day, when it was growing up, and your day, we had our pit toilets, which went down like 10 feet, if so much, sometimes 6 feet. And when they became full, we filled the top with dirt, and we moved to another location, dig another hole, and continue. So never at any point did the feces of a human being get down to the water table. But now we have a situation where we're digging wells down 20, 30 feet or more, and all of our feces are going into the water table. So now we are funding the Barbados Water Authority, having to put a whole lot of chlorine into the water, because whenever they test the water from time to time, they're finding fecal coliforms in the water table now, in the water that is being pumped into the system now for us to use. And more than one person tell me that is a direct result of wells being dug so deep for us to have our waterborne toilets now, and the feces water is getting into direct contact with the water table right now. Correct me.
No, you made your point, Brother Steve. I'm not going to correct you, but what I'm going to say is that the same thing could have happened with the pit toilets. You're saying that they're not digging them deep enough, but you actually weren't flushing anything. All the feces was there. So, I mean, it's a possibility that they could go. But what I understand, though, is that there are only a few of the parishes or a few areas that would have issues in terms of, they usually tell you not to have, like around the Bell area. You familiar with that? Where you can only have certain type of water.
10 feet on the floor, you were butt on water.
Yes, right. So there's certain areas. Yeah, go ahead.
Sister Karamita, there are zones in Barbados from zone 1 to zone 4.
Right.
Generally in zone 4, when it was a boy, which I'm much older than Steve, our wells went down to 20 feet, and our coral stone filters the urine and the effluents. For instance, now we are doing a sewage plant in which we are using gravel to produce water with a considerably low amount of, actually, when it's finished, you can drink the water that comes out from, and they're just using gravel. So our coral stone serves as a good filter for sewage. The only problem would be that if you go into zone 1, and zone 1 is supposed to have set tanks, which takes care of the primary breaking down of the sewage, and then only the effluent is just thing. But if you go and dig a well in zone 1, then you can have problems, but that will only occur in that situation.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you, Brother Peter. As y'all know, Brother Peter is an engineer, so this is beyond my depth what Brother Steve is talking about. So thank you for coming in there, Brother Peter.
Brother Peter is correct in that point, but now we have a case where now our government is actually changing these zone areas to accommodate quote unquote certain people, and some are being changed from zone 1 to zone 2 or zone 3 to allow for habitation. And we are going to get problems seriously because people want to have these fancy wells dug in these areas, and they are going to reach our water table.
In that case, Brother Steve, they're also stipulating that you use sewage treatment plants.
Let's wait and see.
Okay. All right. So thank you for that. Any other questions? Because we don't want to go into anybody else's time. Okay, the Galaxy S9, that is you, Steve. That person asked the question already. You can take your hand down. Go ahead, Adrian Carter. S9, you answer your question already? Okay, go ahead.
In terms of water, which is the best water to drink?
I really don't subscribe to all the different waters, so.
I mean to say, we the sell bottled waters, and at work you have a fountain that is filter the water so that it be clean for you to drink.
Yeah, you see what they did. I saw an article where they had about 10 different types of bottled water. And when they checked the pH, about 8 of them were worse than using the ordinary tap water. So people on a water craze, and they sell you anything, but it's not necessarily spring water. But they usually say spring water is one of the best, but most natural. But I don't want to get into the water thing because they have some people that sell all different types of water, and I don't want to get into advise you as to which one, you know, you should buy or shouldn't buy. And the one that we used to get at church, that is considered one of the better waters. But again, I haven't done enough research into the different types of waters to really advise you, brother Adrian. Okay.
What about the water fountain? That's okay.
That's tap water. That's the same water that you would get from a tap, which is chlorinated. It's okay. I don't have any problem with just drinking, because our water in Barbados is well chlorinated and is but if you tend to have any problem with kidney stones or any issues like that, then you need softer water. So then you need to get filters and make sure that you have a container with a filter, and you filter your water and you take it with you. And that would probably be better.
All right.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
All right, so if there are no further questions, we'll just go ahead and have a closing prayer, and then I will turn over to the next presenter. Dear kind and loving Father, we'd like to thank you for the knowledge that you've given us in public health, even the knowledge of Leviticus and Genesis, the ideal diet, the things that we should do. Dear Father, help us not to take them for granted, because we have moved on throughout the years and in advancement, and even the knowledge that you've given us through Ellen G. White about those substances. Help that we may put them into practice, help that we may eat right and live the right type of lifestyle that you would have us to live. For Christ's sake, amen. I see one person saying that there was Fuller's soap. I haven't investigated in the Bible back in the Old Testament. So that is something that you can research, Sister Lilith. This Fuller's soap. Yes. I have no idea. Yeah.
Just to mention quickly, the soap was used by the Babylonians and Egyptians 3,000 years before Christ. They knew how to take vegetable or animal fat and mix it with wood alkali, and the Israelites also got to use it as well. But you can do the research and see that they knew of primitive soaps that worked quite well back then.
Okay, thank you. Have a good evening.